series of events that occur from the beginning of one heartbeat to the beginning of the next is called the cardiac cycle. Here's what happens during one cardiac cycle. In the first step of the cardiac cycle, venous blood returns to the heart and fills the atria. As it does, pressure in the atria rises above that in the ventricles. This causes the atrioventricular valves to open and blood flows into the ventricles. This period is called passive ventricular filling. Atrial systole then occurs. In this phase, the atria contract to eject their remaining volume of blood to the relaxed ventricles. At this point, the atrioventricular valves are open and the semilunar valves are closed. Following is isovolumetric contraction, a brief period during which the ventricles are beginning to contract, but the semilunar valves haven't yet opened. The volume of blood in the ventricles remains constant, but the pressure rises rapidly as the ventricles begin to contract. When the pressure in the ventricles exceeds the pressure in the pulmonary artery and aorta, the semilunar valves open and the phase of ventricular ejection begins. The blood spurts out of each ventricle, rapidly at first, and then more slowly as the pressure drops. The ventricles don't eject all of their blood. The blood remaining in the ventricles at the end of the ejection period is the residual volume. At the end of ventricular...
That's important to look at is residual volume, because we'll do this again with pulmonary, looking at residual volume of air. But we can't possibly squeeze out every little last bit of blood, so there will be a little bit that's left in there.
Ejection. A brief period occurs during which both the atrioventricular and semilunar valves are closed. Specifically, the semilunar valves have closed to prevent blood from re-entering the ventricles, but the atrioventricular valves have not yet opened. In this phase, called isovolumetric ventricular relaxation, the volume of blood in the ventricles remains unchanged, but the pressure declines dramatically as the ventricles relax.
Okay, so who was the primary pacemaker, the one that's at 60 to 100? Your SA, so number D, or letter D. Okay, all this means is heart rate. We know what heart rate is, how fast your heart beats. So say it's beating at 80. Stroke volume, that's how much volume of blood your heart is pushing out with each contraction. This value you would be given. So if your patient, you can measure some stroke volumes with a catheter in the aorta sitting there and measuring the pressures coming out. So this would be something you were given. So this isn't something that you would be able to come up with and calculate on your own. It would be a number given to you. So that tells you your overall cardiac output, how well that heart is doing. We do have to get into a little bit of nervous system because it is controlled by the brain stem in particular. But and there are some endocrine controls as well when we talk about cardiac. But Sarah had said something about how can someone be brain dead and their heart still beating. And this is where we're talking about brain stem. So that's the very top part of the spinal cord. So not really higher level thinking. All this cortex up here is where that makes you you. This is you doing all the thinking, voluntary movements, all that stuff. Whereas brain stem is involuntary. You don't control it whatsoever. Your medulla, so that's what we call the cardiac center, and that's what's highlighted there. This is what's going to control how fast your heart beats and how hard it contracts. So, looking at, we've talked about exercising, what can happen if you're exercising. That means we're using some really large muscles to do some energy. We use a lot of oxygen for that. So when we're exercising, why does our heart rate go up? We need more oxygen to work those muscles. So if you're exercising, then yes, you can have an outside factor that will increase heart rate. So the demand for oxygen is increased. This is going to create what is called your sympathetic nervous system to be stimulated. Sympathetic, I think, stress. S for stress. If you're stressed, if you're nervous, your heart races, that's your sympathetic nervous system. Your sympathetic and your parasympathetic are always fighting against each other. They go back and forth, and that's what gives you your normal heart rate. Yes, Maddie?
What about like, sorry, what about like, when you're like really, really scared, you know? And
That's your sympathetic. So
It is?
sympathetic, you've always heard of in your biology classes as your fight or flight. So you're either going to get, when you're mad, your heart is racing. If you're scared, your heart is racing. So why does your heart race? Why does it beat really, really fast and you breathe faster? If you're scared or if you're mad, want to fight. You do get an adrenaline rush, but why?
I don't know, because you should need more oxygen.
Yes. Caitlin's awesome. Because your body is preparing for motion. You're either going to fight, you're going to need lots of oxygen to fight and beat up Devin or whoever it is, or you're going to need a lot of oxygen to move this body and run. So yeah, that's the sympathetic nervous system, fight or flight. So here we can stimulate it by exercising. Exercise is a stress on your body, a good stress.
So I'm a very, very jumpy person.
Mhm.
So like when I get really, really scared, it's just my like, because you don't even have to like be hiding. Like you can just be like, whoa, and I'm
Yeah.
like I jump because I'm scared. Well, so like well, so like, is that my?
That's your sympathetic
I always
nervous
feel like
system.
I'm gonna have like a heart attack right there because I always go.
Whew.
Cause I
Yeah, because you feel your heart.
Make sure it's still there.
Get scared, like, is that really like real or is that just something people say?
I mean, you would really have to have something wrong with your heart for it to increase that quickly to where you'd have a heart attack.
Okay.
Okay, so it causes it will release some hormones, norepinephrine, and epinephrine, which will increase that heart rate. So that's some actual hormones from the endocrine system. That's all sympathetic. So at the same time, trying to fight against it and do the opposite is your inhibitory center, coming from the medulla still, the innervation of it, and it's the parasympathetic. That is what's controlling you right now, is your parasympathetic nervous system. You're relaxed, you're laid back, your heart's beating at a normal pace,
So if a bomb
you're
were to go off-
digesting food. If a bomb went off in the storage room, we would be scared to death, and it would be sympathetic nervous system. Your heart would be racing, you would stop digesting food, because who cares about digesting food? We're fixing to die. Okay.
You don't need food. Oh, yeah. That'll be break time in like 33 seconds.
Okay, let me finish up here because I think and then we'll look at that stuff. So proprioceptors, I think of proprioceptors as like pressure receptors because they feel and detect movement. So the muscles moving and the joints moving, they're picking up information. Oh my goodness, she's moving. We need to beat a little faster because she's using muscles. So that's what proprioceptors are for. Baroreceptors are your true pressure receptors, but they're not picking up pressure as far as movement and weight on joints and muscles, but they're picking up the amount of pressure in a vessel, especially the aorta. You have some carotids that are picking up that pressure too. So it's some big ones right here in your neck that are detecting and sensing pressure constantly. So if the pressure's low, if you're running 80/60, then it's going to say, hey, heart, beat faster. We need more blood. Our pressure's too low. And then vice versa. If pressure gets too high, then they'll say, hey, slow down. Those are your baroreceptors. So think of like blood pressure. If you think B for blood pressure. Chemoreceptors, again, in the aorta, particularly in the big branched arch in your carotids and the medulla, so up in the brainstem, they're picking up and detecting oxygen levels, CO2 levels. You know, do we need to beat faster? Do we need to beat slower? Depending on those chemicals that are in the blood, and those chemicals being oxygen and carbon dioxide. All right, we'll come back and pick up on after break, preload,
We'll be right back
contractility,
after
afterload.